Now it's time to start with the overview of the software, the overview of the user interface and the basic workflow. This video will be quite long, but I will try to stick really to the foundations. I will not spend my time explaining one tool after the others. It will be dedicated to other videos, but at least for you to understand where you are and what you have to do, I would say globally. The first thing that also you need to consider is, I will not explain how to install the software. This process is quite useful. I consider at this stage that you already download the software, you did the install, and when starting the software for the first time, you'll be asked to create your account. Then you create your account and it asks for the selection of your 3D printer. Then I consider you did all these steps, and this is what I did. I'm right now in Lychee Slicer and I selected on my first launch a resin 3D printer. Why it is important? Because as you can see, my UI is in gray and blue color. If you have selected a filament 3D printer, the UI will be in gray and orange color. Then this is something which is quite important. Then before explaining the interface, I will just show you how to add a new 3D printer, and based on that we will switch, of course, between all the items of the user interface. On the top left of the UI, you have here a series of buttons like 3D printer, resin, history, library, import, etc. But just focus on 3D printer and just resin. Keep that resin in mind. I click on this 3D printer button and Lychee Slicer opens a pop-up which will list on top all your 3D printers. For now I just have one, and below you have, for the selected 3D printer, all the printing parameters, especially for resin printers, all the resin settings that you have to use, speed, etc., exposure. This is of course the subject of other videos. But I would like to add a new printer. Just click on this add button and you have this pop-up which appears, and you can select if you want to add a resin printer. Let's say you have two different types of resin printers, or a filament 3D printer. Let me just add a filament 3D printer. You have the full list like you have the first time you launch the software. It asks you for all of that. I will go to, let's say, any cubic printer and go to the Cobra 2 3D printer. And as you can see, this printer has been selected and everything now is in orange, while if I select a resin printer, it will be in blue. Just keep that in mind. And as you can see, you have the filament printing settings below. For resin printer, I have the printing setting for resin. Then this, everything here will be important and of course dependent of the type of 3D printer you've selected. Let me go back to the Saturn 2 and I will explain most of the things with the resin printers, because some parts are quite the same, and other things, of course, I will switch between the two printers because there is some differences. Right now I'm in front of the default UI of the application. You have things which will move based on the context, meaning that if nothing in the 3D space has been selected, right now I have nothing on my scene, or something is selected, you have a different content. If you have in a different menu, workspace, functions, the content will be quite different. Then how to start? This is very easy. I will just click on this library, which is open by default. Click on this small chicken. A 3D model will be loaded. Another way to load a 3D model is to do a drag and drop from a folder directly in the interface of the software in the 3D space, or using this import button there, or going in the file and then you can click directly on the import 3D file. You have multiple ways to do the same actions, but the idea, just to start with Lychee Slicer, just load in the library there on top on the left of the UI, just the chicken, to be sure we have the same thing. Then now let's discover this UI of Lychee Slicer. As you can see on top, we have a menu like you can find in most software, of course, file, edit, object, views. This menu is dynamic. Like I said before, if you are in a different, let's say, workspace, we'll speak about that just later, the menu will change. Below you have these buttons which are quite important. Like I said, resin, 3D printer resin, the history, library, just open and import. You have in the middle this 3D workspace area, the scene, we call that a scene in 3D, a 3D scene with a 3D model. If you click on it, which has been selected, and a tool right now has been launched and is executed, like the move tool for now. because why you have on this left side of the UI the list of functions, tools, more tools than function, the tools like the arrange tools, the move tool, the rotate tools, and as you can see, some tools have sub tools, like you have the rotate, on plate, object to object, auto orient, reset, etc., etc. You have the scale, copy, blah blah blah. All these tools will be the subject of dedicated videos, of course. On top of that, you have the object, not a function. This is more the list of objects in your scene, which right now is listing only one object, which can be stay open or you can close it as you wish. You have, like I said, your 3D scene. On top of that, I will just come back later in a few seconds. You have the layout workspace, you have the prepare workspace and export workspace. Then these things are quite important, but let's go back to that later. And on the right of the UI, you have potentially or not a list of settings and parameters. Right now, my scale function has been selected, my scale tool, sorry, has been selected, and on the right you can see that you have for the scale functionality multiple settings. You can change the scales. You may have also a function like the uniform scaling. Let's say I want to put 150%. Everything has been updated to 150% because the uniform scaling is on. And if I want to reset my scale, if I want to reset my scale, click on it, everything has been resetted. If I click on this move button, same thing. I have less values, but I have more tools like center, on platform, arrange all, etc., etc. Then you will find this concept of having a tools being selected and having on the right options that you can have, or some tools like the copy. Directly you have the actions next to it, number of copies, auto arrange, and so on. By the way, if you select some functionality like, let's say, the measure tool, it will work, but you see, oh, there is a pro button. If I click on it to create, you see, it's a, sorry, you need to be a pro user to use this functionality. Then a lot, not all, but a lot of pro features let you discover the way it's working, but if you want to use it at the full capacity, you have to use to be a pro user of Lychee Slicer. Anyway, what I wanted to explain, you have the tools on one side and the parameters on the other side, which are dynamic based on the tool that you have. And one thing which is also quite important is on the top right of the UI, you have this big cube there. You can click and drag to do a rotation, or you can click on, you see this selection like the front area, and it will move the camera on the front view, or let's say this corner there or there, etc. Then it can be used for the 3D navigation. You can click on this small home button and then you reset to the original position of the camera for Lychee Slicer, and you have this small gear icon to access some, I would say, parameters like the orthographic or perspective mode of the UI. By the way, you have some hotkeys in Lychee Slicer like the zero button, the zero key, sorry, on your keyboard to switch between perspective and orthographic. You have multiple hotkeys like that in Lychee Slicer. You can flip the camera, because if you are a resin 3D printer user, you know that your 3D printing process is going from bottom to the top in Lychee Slicer. Then if you want to work the same way as your 3D printer, you can do it. Okay, and you have other options like wireframe mode, normal, layer thickness preview. You can save your views, etc., etc. And while I was doing that, you may have noted that on top there you have this pop-up which appears. It's only a reminder that you didn't save your scene, and for whatever reason you quit your software, you crash, it can happen, you may lose your work. Then this is quite important to save your scene. You have two options to save as a default scene, or what we call a lit scene, which is not saving the 3D model inside of the project, but more as external references. Up to you. Of course, you can go to the file menu and you have save scene or save scene as, like other tools or like other software. Let me just close that for this presentation. There is no need to save for now. Then this is a global overview of, oh, sorry, no, I forgot. I was in 3D navigation. And what is important is, of course, you can navigate there, but how I can zoom in and out, how I can pan the view, the best is to use a 3D, not a 3D mouse, but a mouse with, of course, 2 buttons and a mouse wheel. You see, I move my mouse wheel right now. I can zoom in and out. What is important is that the zoom, when you scroll your mouse wheel, it will zoom on the position of the cursor. You see my cursor is on top or on bottom. It will try to orient the zoom position. And if you press on the mouse wheel button, you can do like that a pan. And if you want to use other hotkeys, you can use, especially if you are using a pen tablet. I'm right now on a pen tablet, in fact with a screen. You want to use your pen which doesn't have a mouse wheel. You can use the Alt key and pressing the right click, to do a pan. You can use still the Control key to do your zoom in and out, and of course your right click to do navigation. Then don't forget that you can use the right click with Control Alt, of course, to do this operation like the zoom, like I said, the Alt with pan, and of course the rotation with just the right click. Anyway, I think we saw almost everything about the UI for the layout, and now things will change a little bit because I will switch to this. You see this button on top, layout, you have prepare and export. Layout, this is where you organize your build plates for your 3D printer. When you put all your models, you change the scale, like you, of course, you guess, with all the tools, the rotations, etc. You have other tools like the mirror, the copy. You can cut your model, you can split, merge, etc., etc. And then when your model, let's say, has been well organized, or you can do that after if you want, you can switch to the prepare section. And as you can see, and you remember I mentioned that the context can change. On the left of the UI, the tools change. You don't see any more move, rotate, scale, etc. But you see support, raft, hollow, visibility, etc., etc. And on the right side of the UI, you can see all the parameters and sub-functions, I would say functions, features for the support. You see, you have the presets, manual, proximity, etc., etc. And as you can see, a lot of them have the Pro tag. Then, what is important again is the context. But if my 3D printer is not a resin printer, you will have something different. Remember, we added this filament 3D printer. Now, if I just move my cursor on top of this UI, I have this small switch, and I can change from filament to resin printer, from resin to filament 3D printer. Then I click on filament, and Lychee Slicer let me know that, oh, be careful, if you switch from one type of printer to another printer, 3D printer, you may lose some information, mainly the supports, because they are not the same at all. Then you can save your scene and continue to the other type of 3D printer, or for me, nothing changed. Then I switch to the other type. And as you can see, my UI changed now to the orange color. On top, I have 3D printer, not anymore a resin but filament, and as you can see, my tools on the left change to be something different, like the override. Support icon also is different, visibility, batch, etc., etc., and still the object list. And override is a tool specific for filament, and on the right side of the UI, you see I have this basic adhesion, all the parameters. Then the context is quite important. But if you want to prepare your 3D models for 3D printing, doing your support, etc., etc., this is where you will do everything in the prepare section. Let me go back to the resin printer, click on continue, and you see support. If I want to add some support like that, I can add my support. I can delete them by clicking on them to select them and pressing the delete key on my keyboard. Then something which are quite, I would say, usual in a slicer. Of course, I will explain that better and more into details in other videos. Now, something which is also very important in this prepare section, and also that we will find in the export section, is what we call the clipping bar, which is on the right of the UI, really at the limit of the UI. You see, this is this bar, and if you click and drag on it, you see that you can see a sliced version of the 3D model. Right now, if I just hover the manipulator, I'm at the layer 309 or 15.43 millimeters, and like that you can work, and it can be very helpful for you to understand better what you are doing, and based on that you can move like that and understanding better what you are doing. Then that's all for this overview of this prepare section, but I forgot to explain one thing even at the beginning for the layout. Just on the bottom left of the UI, you have this small text in gray, which just reminds you that you currently have the Elegoo Saturn II 3D printer which has been selected. This is a default resin with default parameters at 50 microns. Right now, you see my top model is going up to 40 millimeters, meaning the top of my model here is at 40 millimeters, and you can estimate the 3D printing time, which is roughly at 2 hours and 57 minutes, and you can estimate as well, after some computing, the volume used by for this 3D print in resin. Then that's all for the prepare section, and now let me switch to the export section, which is roughly what you will do at the end. But there is something that you need to consider, is that in the export section, what you have by default on the right side, you have few tools to have a different visibility of your 3D model, but also the simulator for resin printers only, not for filament, which presents you a kind of 3D printers, and you can simulate your 3D print. You can just go down your model and see directly how it will happen. And when you are a beginner, this is very helpful to understand how things are working. This is just the clipping bar with the 3D navigation, which has been flipped for the camera. But trust me, when you are a beginner, this is quite important to see how it will work, to really understand, to help you understand the process of 3D printing. Or you have the at scale functionality there, which is banana for scale, that you have in both versions of the slicer. The idea is not really to see the clipping bar, but having a kind of best perception of the size of your 3D model, because you see this lychee cola can or this banana or pen are based on the real world size. Also the mat, you have the graduation, sorry, in centimeters, there is no, I think we have inches, yes, on the side, will help you to have a better understanding of the 3D model. And that's why it's not only exporting, this is also doing all the steps to understand better before exporting your 3D model. And of course, you have all the parameters to export, especially for resin printers, or let me switch back to filament printers. Can continue. Same thing, you have banana for scale, all parameters. Okay, this is the filament you selected, the G-code, you can slice just to have a preview of your slice model. Then like that. Then the whole process is roughly the same, whatever you are in resin printer or filament printers, but of course the context, sorry, I'm repeating myself multiple times, but the context is dependent of the 3D printer that you have. But it means that as soon as you understand quite well the software, switching from filament to resin or vice versa will be exactly the same. Of course, we need to learn the specificities of each type of 3D printer, filament of resin, but it will be quite easy. Then I hope that this global overview of Lychee Slicer will be quite helpful. Of course, now the other videos, the future video after this one, will go more into details about specific features, the manipulation of your 3D model, preparing of supports, etc., etc. Then I hope you enjoy this overview and see you in the next videos.